My name is Sarah, and I've been a pediatric ICU nurse for 23 years. In those 2 decades, I've held the hands of dying children, comforted grieving parents, and watched miracles unfold in sterile hospital rooms. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I witnessed on that cold February morning when an intern's whispered warning would expose the most horrifying act of medical arrogance I've ever encountered. This is the story of how one man's God complex killed an innocent child, and how I made sure he paid the ultimate professional price for it. The pediatric ICU at St. Mary's General Hospital was my domain. I knew every beep, every alarm, every subtle change in the rhythm of life support machines. Room 314 had been home to 10-year-old Leo Martinez for the past 6 months. Cystic fibrosis had ravaged his lungs since birth, and by age 10, this bright, curious boy was fighting for every breath. His parents, Maria and Carlos, had immigrated from El Salvador 15 years ago, working double shifts at a textile factory to afford the medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. They spoke broken English, but their love for Leo was universal, transcending language barriers as they took turns sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside his bed. Leo's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His oxygen saturation levels hovered dangerously low, despite maximum ventilator support. His small chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, but his natural lung function was virtually non-existent. The only hope was a double lung transplant, and we'd been on the waiting list for 8 months. 8 months of watching this little boy's body slowly give up, while his spirit remained unbreakably optimistic. He would draw pictures of himself playing soccer, running on the beach, breathing freely under the sun. Those drawings covered the walls of room 314, a gallery of hope in a place where hope often died. Dr. Richard Miller was the chief of thoracic surgery at St. Mary's. If you asked anyone in the hospital about him, they'd tell you he was a legend. Trained at Johns Hopkins, published author of 3 medical textbooks, and boasting a transplant success rate that made him famous worldwide. Medical journals featured his techniques, conferences flew him first class to deliver keynote speeches, and medical students competed viciously for the chance to observe his surgeries. But if you asked any nurse who actually worked with him, you'd get a very different story. Miller was arrogant, condescending, and treated nursing staff like educated servants. He never learned names, rarely acknowledged our presence, and had a particularly nasty habit of overruling nursing assessments without even reviewing the charts. I'd clashed with Miller numerous times over the years. He'd dismiss post-operative complications I'd identified, ignore medication interactions I'd flagged, and generally behave as if his medical degree made him infallible. The hospital administration loved him because he brought prestige and money. Wealthy patients flew in from around the world specifically to have Miller perform their surgeries, paying premium rates that kept the hospital profitable. The board of directors treated him like royalty, and Miller had learned to expect that level of deference from everyone. On February 15th, at approximately 3:47 a.m., everything changed. I was completing my rounds when Ben Crawford, a first-year internal medicine resident doing his pediatric rotation, practically ran into the ICU. Ben was one of the good ones, the kind of young doctor who still believed medicine was about healing rather than ego or profit. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the hospital's perpetual chill. He looked around nervously, then approached my station with the cautious movements of someone about to deliver terrible news. "Sarah," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder toward the elevator bank. "I need to tell you something about Leo's transplant. We got a match." My heart should have leaped with joy. A match meant Leo might finally get his chance at a normal childhood. But Ben's expression told me this wasn't good news. He leaned closer, his voice barely audible over the constant hum of medical equipment. "The donor," Ben continued, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled up electronic records on his tablet. He was a 73-year-old man. Motorcycle accident, brain death, perfect size match for Leo's body. But Sarah... Ben paused, swallowing hard. He was a 3-pack-a-day smoker for 57 years. The lungs are completely compromised. Severe emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and early-stage lung cancer in the left lower lobe. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's impossible. Miller wouldn't use damaged organs. The screening process, I tried to tell him. Ben interrupted, his voice cracking with desperation. I showed him the donor's medical history. the chest x-rays, the pathology reports. You know what he said? He said his surgical skills could overcome any donor limitations. He actually laughed at me, Sarah. He called me a nervous intern who doesn't understand the complexities of transplant surgery. The full horror of the situation hit me like a freight train. Miller was planning to transplant diseased, cancer-ridden lungs into a 10-year-old boy. This wasn't just medical malpractice. It was essentially murder disguised as treatment. I looked toward room 314, where Leo's parents were sleeping in shifts, believing their prayers had finally been answered. "When is the surgery scheduled?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. 6 a.m. Miller's already in pre-op preparation. The donor lungs are being prepped for transport from Presbyterian Hospital across town. Sarah, I've tried everything. I went to the chief resident, but he said Miller's transplant decisions are beyond resident oversight. I even called the donor hospital to double-check the records, hoping maybe there was some mistake. There wasn't. Those lungs are a death sentence. I've never felt more helpless in my entire nursing career. Here was a child who trusted us completely, parents who believed in the miracle of modern medicine, and a surgeon whose arrogance was about to destroy all of it. But what could we do? Miller had absolute authority in his operating room. The hospital administration would never question his judgment, especially not based on concerns raised by a nurse and an intern. That's when Ben grabbed my arm and whispered the words that would haunt me forever. He put a smoker's lungs in a kid. The way he said it, like a confession or a prophecy, made me realize this wasn't just about Leo anymore. This was about every child who might end up on Miller's table in the future. Every family who would trust their most precious gift to a man who valued his reputation more than human life. I made a decision that would define the rest of my career. If we couldn't stop Miller, we could at least document everything. Every vital sign, every complication, every moment of Leo's inevitable decline would be recorded with meticulous precision. When this child died, and he would die, there would be an irrefutable paper trail leading directly back to Miller's criminal negligence. "Ben," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest, "get me every piece of documentation about this donor. Medical history, autopsy photos if available, pathology reports, everything. And I mean everything. If you've been following the Hospital Revenge channel, you know that sometimes the only way to fight a corrupt system is to use that system's own rules against it. Medicine is built on documentation, protocols, and accountability, at least in theory. What we were about to do would test whether those principles actually mattered when facing someone as powerful as Dr. Richard Miller. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that arrogance should never triumph over a child's life, make sure you're subscribed to Hospital Revenge, because the stories we share here expose the dark underbelly of healthcare that administrators prefer to keep hidden. At 5:30 a.m., I made my way to the preoperative area where Leo was being prepared for surgery. The anesthesia team was already setting up their equipment, IV lines were being inserted, and Leo was fighting off the pre-medication sedation to wave at his parents through the observation window. Maria was crying tears of joy, clutching a rosary and whispering prayers of gratitude. Carlos stood stoically beside her, but I could see the relief in his eyes. After months of watching their son slowly suffocate, they believed salvation was finally at hand. Dr. Miller swept into the prep area like a conquering hero, his surgical scrubs pressed to perfection, his confidence radiating throughout the room. He barely glanced at Leo's chart, instead focusing on the assembled medical team that would assist in what he undoubtedly considered another triumph for his legendary career. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miller announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute deference, "today we save another life. This will be my 847th successful transplant, and I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you." I couldn't stay silent. "Dr. Miller, I've reviewed the donor information, and I have concerns about the organ quality." Miller turned toward me with the kind of withering stare reserved for impertinent children. "Ms." He paused, realizing he didn't actually know my name despite working together for years. "Nurse, I appreciate your input, but transplant decisions are made by qualified physicians, not nursing staff. Perhaps you should focus on your actual responsibilities." The dismissal was so casual, so effortlessly condescending, that it took my breath away. This man was about to kill a child, and he couldn't even be bothered to learn the name of the nurse who'd been caring for that child for 6 months. The donor was a heavy smoker with emphysema and early-stage cancer. I pressed on, knowing I was crossing a line that could end my career. Those lungs are severely compromised. Miller's face flushed with anger. Are you questioning my medical judgment? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I've performed more successful transplants than any surgeon on the West Coast. I've saved more lives than you could count. And you, a nurse, think you understand organ viability better than I do? The entire prep room fell silent. Nurses stopped their activities. Technicians froze mid-task. And even the anesthesiologist looked uncomfortable. Everyone knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. A direct challenge to Miller's authority. I understand that child, I said, pointing toward Leo, who was now unconscious from the pre-medication. I've watched him fight for every breath for 6 months. I've held his hand during panic attacks when his oxygen levels dropped. I've comforted his parents in 3 different languages. I've earned the right to speak up when I believe his life is in danger. Miller stepped closer to me, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Let me make something very clear, nurse. You work for this hospital, and this hospital's reputation depends on surgeons like me. If you continue to interfere with my surgical decisions, I'll make sure your employment here becomes very difficult. Now, either do your job or get out of my operating room. That was the moment I knew Miller would kill Leo. Not through malice, but through the kind of arrogance that considered any challenge to his authority more dangerous than a child's death. I looked at Ben, who was standing near the donor organ transport container, his face pale with horror and helplessness. Ben, I said quietly, making sure Miller could hear me. Document everything. Every vital sign, every post-operative complication, every medication response. Document it all. Miller laughed. Actually laughed, as if my threat was amusing rather than serious. Document away, nurse. When this surgery is successful, your documentation will serve as evidence of your unprofessional behavior and lack of medical knowledge. The surgery lasted 7 hours and 23 minutes. Ben and I took turns monitoring Leo's post-operative status, recording every detail with obsessive precision. The transplanted lungs showed signs of rejection almost immediately. Leo's oxygen saturation levels remained dangerously low despite maximum ventilator support. His body was fighting the diseased organs, recognizing them as foreign and harmful rather than life-saving. Within 12 hours, it was clear the transplant was failing catastrophically. Leo's new lungs were filling with fluid. His chest X-rays showed massive inflammation, and his blood work indicated severe organ rejection. But Miller refused to acknowledge any problems. He ordered increased immunosuppression, more aggressive ventilator settings, and a cocktail of experimental medications that only served to weaken Leo's already compromised immune system. It's normal post-operative adjustment, Miller insisted during his rounds, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The patient's body needs time to accept the new organs. These temporary complications are entirely expected. But they weren't temporary, and they weren't expected. Leo was dying slowly, his small body overwhelmed by organs that should never have been transplanted in the first place. Maria and Carlos spent every moment at his bedside, watching helplessly as their son's condition deteriorated. They couldn't understand the medical terminology, but they could see their child slipping away despite the promised miracle. On the 3rd post-operative day, Leo developed pneumonia in both transplanted lungs. His fever spiked to 104 degrees. His blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and his kidneys began failing from the toxic effects of all the medications being pumped into his system. Miller ordered more aggressive treatments, more experimental drugs, more interventions that only prolonged Leo's suffering without addressing the fundamental problem. The lungs killing him were diseased from the moment they were transplanted. I've been fighting this system long enough to know that sometimes you have to let the tragedy play out completely before you can expose the truth. It's horrible. It's heartbreaking. But it's the only way to build an airtight case against someone as powerful as Miller. Every complication, every failed treatment, every moment of Leo's decline was building toward the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And this is where I need you to understand something important. If you're watching this channel, if you're following these stories of hospital revenge, it's because you believe in accountability. You believe that power should never shield someone from the consequences of their actions. What we did next required incredible courage from Ben and unwavering determination from me. But it also required documentation. Meticulous, irrefutable documentation that would ultimately destroy Miller's career. If you believe in what we're doing here, if you think these stories matter, take a moment to hit that like button and leave a comment about your own experiences with medical arrogance. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. On February 22nd, exactly 7 days after the transplant surgery, Leo Martinez died at 2:17 a.m. His parents were holding his hands, whispering prayers and promises they could no longer keep. I was monitoring his vitals when his heart finally stopped, overwhelmed by the systemic organ failure that had been inevitable from the moment those diseased lungs were placed in his chest. Miller pronounced the death as acute transplant rejection, a common enough complication that wouldn't raise any administrative eyebrows. He offered his condolences to Maria and Carlos in the perfunctory manner of someone who viewed patient deaths as statistical inevitabilities rather than human tragedies. In his mind, Leo's death was simply the unfortunate outcome of a high-risk procedure, not the predictable result of criminal negligence. But I knew better. And more importantly, I had spent the past week building a case that would prove it. The next morning, I approached Maria and Carlos with the most difficult conversation of my nursing career. They were packing Leo's few belongings: his drawings, a stuffed elephant, some books in Spanish that Carlos read to him every night, preparing to take their son home for burial. "Maria, Carlos," I said gently, sitting beside them in the family conference room. "I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to talk to you about Leo's death." They looked at me with the hollow eyes of parents who had just lost everything. Maria clutched Leo's elephant to her chest, and Carlos reached for her hand instinctively. "There were problems with Leo's surgery," I continued, choosing my words carefully. "Problems that might have contributed to his death. I think you deserve to know the truth about what happened." I explained everything: the donor's smoking history, the diseased condition of the transplanted lungs, Miller's refusal to acknowledge the obvious complications, and the systematic documentation that Ben and I had compiled. I told them about medical malpractice, about patient rights, and about their option to request an independent autopsy. Carlos translated for Maria, his voice breaking as he struggled to find Spanish words for concepts like medical negligence and criminal misconduct. When he finished, Maria's grief transformed into something harder, more focused. She looked directly at me and said, in careful English, "You help us. You help Leo. You make doctor pay." That afternoon, Maria and Carlos signed the forms requesting an independent autopsy. The procedure would be performed by Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a forensic pathologist at the county medical examiner's office who had no relationship with St. Mary's Hospital or Dr. Miller. She was known for her meticulous work and her willingness to challenge medical establishments when the evidence warranted it. The autopsy took place 3 days later. Dr. Chen's findings were even worse than I had anticipated. The transplanted lungs showed severe emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and multiple cancerous lesions that should have immediately disqualified them for transplantation. More damning still, her examination revealed that the organs had been failing from the moment they were transplanted, contradicting Miller's claims about normal post-operative complications. But the most devastating finding was Dr. Chen's conclusion about the cause of death. Leo hadn't died from transplant rejection. He had died from acute respiratory failure caused by the implantation of organs that were already in end-stage disease. In layman's terms, Leo had been murdered by a surgeon who valued his success statistics more than a child's life. The autopsy report was 19 pages of clinical evidence, photographs, and expert analysis that painted an undeniable picture of medical malpractice. Combined with Ben's meticulous documentation of the post-operative period and my detailed nursing notes about Miller's refusal to acknowledge complications, we had built a case that no medical board could ignore. On March 3rd, exactly 2 weeks after Leo's death, I drafted the most important email of my career. It was addressed to every member of St. Mary's Hospital Board of Directors, with copies to the State Medical Licensing Board, the County District Attorney's Office, and the Regional Office of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. The subject line read, "Urgent. Evidence of criminal medical negligence resulting in pediatric patient death." I attached Dr. Chen's complete autopsy report, Ben's post-operative documentation, my nursing assessments, the donor's complete medical history, and a detailed timeline of events from the night Ben first warned me about the transplant through Leo's death 7 days later. The evidence package was over 200 pages of irrefutable proof that Dr. Richard Miller had knowingly transplanted diseased organs into a child, leading directly to that child's death. But I didn't stop there. I also included copies of Leo's drawings, those hopeful pictures of a boy who dreamed of breathing freely, running on beaches, playing soccer with his friends. I wanted the board members to see exactly what Miller had destroyed with his arrogance. The email concluded with a simple statement. Leo Martinez trusted Dr. Miller with his life. His parents trusted this hospital with their most precious gift. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. I have documented every aspect of this tragedy to ensure that Leo's death was not in vain, and that no other child will suffer the same fate. I sent the email at 11:47 p.m., then sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, watching the lights in the administrative offices. Within an hour, I could see unusual activity. People arriving at the hospital despite the late hour, lights turning on in conference rooms, and what looked like an emergency meeting taking place on the executive floor. The next morning, Dr. Miller was suspended pending investigation. By that afternoon, the state medical board had opened a formal inquiry. Within a week, the county district attorney announced that criminal charges were being considered. And within a month, St. Mary's Hospital faced a wrongful death lawsuit that would ultimately cost them $12 million in damages, money that went to Maria and Carlos to help them rebuild their lives after losing their son. But the real victory wasn't financial. Miller's medical license was permanently revoked after a hearing where Leo's autopsy report was read in its entirety. His transplant program was shut down, his research funding was terminated, and his reputation was destroyed so completely that no hospital would even consider hiring him as a consultant. The man who had performed 847 successful transplants would never operate again. 6 months later, I received a letter from Maria. She had learned enough English to write it herself, though Carlos had helped with some of the more complex words. She told me that they had used part of the settlement money to establish a scholarship fund for nursing students, specifically for those who wanted to work in pediatric care. The Leo Martinez Memorial Scholarship would ensure that future nurses were trained to advocate for their patients, even when that advocacy meant challenging powerful doctors. The letter ended with a simple sentence that I've kept framed on my desk ever since. Thank you for seeing Leo as person, not just patient. That's what this is really about. Seeing patients as people rather than statistics, parents as human beings rather than obstacles, and colleagues as partners rather than subordinates. Miller's downfall wasn't just about justice for Leo. It was about changing a culture that allowed arrogance to flourish unchecked in environments where people's lives hung in the balance. The investigation into Miller's other transplant cases revealed a pattern of cutting corners, ignoring contraindications, and prioritizing his success rates over patient safety. 7 other families came forward with concerns about their loved ones' deaths following Miller's surgeries. While not all of those cases involved the same level of obvious negligence as Leo's, the pattern was clear. Miller had been playing God with people's lives for years, and the hospital administration had enabled him because he brought prestige and profit. Today, St. Mary's Hospital has implemented new protocols for organ transplant approval. No single surgeon, regardless of reputation, can make unilateral decisions about organ acceptance. Every potential transplant must be reviewed by a committee that includes nursing staff, and any concerns raised by bedside caregivers must be formally documented and addressed before surgery can proceed. But the most important change is cultural. Nurses at St. Mary's now know that speaking up against dangerous medical decisions isn't just their right, it's their obligation. The Miller Protocols, as they're informally known, have created an environment where patient advocacy is valued more than hierarchical deference. I still work in the pediatric ICU at St. Mary's, though I've since been promoted to nursing supervisor for the entire department. Room 314 has been renamed the Leo Martinez Pediatric Care Suite, and his drawings still hang on the walls, not as memories of tragedy, but as reminders of hope and the importance of fighting for every child who trusts us with their care. Ben completed his residency and is now an attending physician in pediatric pulmonology. He credits his experience with Leo as the defining moment that taught him the importance of standing up for patients, even when it means challenging authority. He's become known throughout the hospital as someone who listens to nursing concerns and treats every team member's input as valuable. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the the forensic pathologist who performed Leo's autopsy, has since testified in dozens of medical malpractice cases. She often cites Leo's case as an example of how thorough documentation and collaborative advocacy can expose even the most well-protected medical negligence. And Miller? Last I heard, he was working as a medical consultant for a malpractice insurance company, reviewing cases and identifying potential liability issues. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had committed one of the most egregious acts of medical malpractice in the hospital's history was now being paid to help insurance companies avoid paying for similar crimes. But this story isn't really about Miller's downfall, or even about Leo's tragic death. It's about the power of documentation, the importance of advocacy, and the responsibility we all have to speak up when we witness injustice. In healthcare, as in many professions, there's often a culture of silence that protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Breaking that silence requires courage. But more importantly, it requires allies. Ben could have stayed quiet after Miller dismissed his concerns. I could have focused on my nursing duties and avoided confrontation with one of the hospital's most powerful doctors. Maria and Carlos could have accepted Miller's explanation that their son died from complications and grieved in private, but none of us stayed silent, and that collective refusal to accept injustice is what ultimately brought Miller down. The system is designed to protect people like Miller, his reputation, his connections, his financial value to the hospital. All of these factors should have made him untouchable. But documentation is more powerful than reputation. Evidence is more compelling than prestige. And the truth, when presented with irrefutable clarity, can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. That's the lesson I want you to take from Leo's story. Whether you work in healthcare, education, law enforcement, or any other field where power dynamics can silence legitimate concerns, remember that your voice matters. Your observations matter. Your willingness to document problems and speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. That matters more than you know. Every industry has its Dr. Millers, people whose egos have grown so large that they believe themselves above accountability. They rely on intimidation, institutional protection, and the assumption that no one will have the courage to challenge them. But they're wrong. There are always people willing to fight back, willing to document the truth, willing to risk their own comfort for the sake of justice. If you've watched this far, if Leo's story has affected you the way it affected me, then you understand why the Hospital Revenge channel exists. We share these stories not for entertainment, but for education. Not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the memory of those who were failed by systems that should have protected them. I want to hear from you. Have you witnessed medical negligence? Have you seen colleagues turn away from obvious problems because challenging authority seemed too risky? Have you been in a situation where speaking up could have made a difference? Leave your comments below, because these conversations matter. They remind us that we're not alone in our commitment to doing what's right, even when doing what's right is difficult. And if this story has convinced you that accountability in healthcare matters, that the voices of nurses and residents and families deserve to be heard, then please consider subscribing to Hospital Revenge. Share this video with others who work in healthcare or who have family members in medical care. The more people who understand these dynamics, the more likely we are to prevent future tragedies. Leo Martinez should be 17 years old now. He should be finishing high school, thinking about college, maybe playing on his school's soccer team like he always dreamed. Instead, he's buried in a small cemetery in East Los Angeles, his grave marked with a headstone that reads, "Beloved son, taken too soon." But his death wasn't meaningless. The changes implemented after his case have protected other children, and the precedent set by his case has made it easier for other families to seek justice when medical negligence destroys their lives. That's the real revenge in this story. Not the destruction of one arrogant surgeon's career, but the systemic changes that ensure his type of negligence becomes much harder to hide. Leo's legacy isn't his death. It's the lives that will be saved, because a nurse, an intern, and 2 grieving parents refused to let his death be dismissed as an acceptable loss. Remember Leo Martinez. Remember that 10-year-old boy who drew pictures of himself breathing freely, who trusted the adults around him to fight for his life. Remember that his death was preventable, and that prevention came too late for him, but not for the children who came after. And remember that in a world where power often protects the guilty, sometimes the only path to justice is through the careful documentation of truth. Miller thought his reputation made him untouchable. He was wrong. The truth, properly documented and courageously presented, will always be more powerful than arrogance. Thank you for listening to Leo's story. Thank you for caring about accountability in healthcare. And thank you for being part of a community that believes some things are worth fighting for, even when that fight seems impossible. Justice for Leo Martinez. Justice for every patient who trusts us with their lives. And justice for the truth, no matter how powerful the people who want to hide it. The aftermath of Miller's case created ripple effects throughout the entire medical community that I'm still witnessing today. 5 years later, the Leo Martinez case became required reading in medical schools across the country, not just as an example of what can go wrong, but as a case study in the importance of multidisciplinary communication and the critical role that nurses play in patient advocacy. What started as one child's preventable death became a catalyst for systemic change in how hospitals handle organ transplants and medical decision-making. But let me tell you about the other cases we uncovered once Miller's protective shield was removed. During the investigation, the State Medical Board requested that I review all of Miller's pediatric transplant cases from the previous 5 years. What I found in those medical records still haunts me. There was 8-year-old Amanda Chen, who received a liver that Miller knew had been damaged during the extraction process. He transplanted it anyway, and Amanda died from hepatic necrosis 6 days later. Miller had listed the cause of death as unexpected complications, but the autopsy showed massive tissue death that could only have resulted from using a compromised organ. Then there was 12-year-old Marcus Williams, who needed a heart transplant after a viral infection destroyed his cardiac muscle. The donor heart came from a teenager who had died from a drug overdose, and toxicology reports showed dangerous levels of methamphetamine still in the cardiac tissue. Miller performed the transplant despite knowing about the contamination, and Marcus suffered a massive heart attack during the surgery. Miraculously, Marcus survived, but he sustained permanent brain damage from the cardiac arrest that occurred on Miller's operating table. The pattern was always the same. Miller would identify marginal organs that other surgeons had rejected, convince desperate families that he could make them work through his superior surgical techniques, and then cover up the inevitable complications by blaming patient factors or claiming that the deaths were within acceptable statistical ranges for high-risk procedures. He had been murdering children for years, and the hospital administration had protected him because his experimental approaches brought research grants and international recognition. Each case I reviewed revealed the same administrative negligence that had enabled Leo's death. Nursing concerns had been dismissed, junior physicians had been intimidated into silence, and families had been fed false hope based on Miller's inflated success statistics. The hospital's own risk management department had identified patterns in Miller's cases, but had been overruled by administrators who valued his revenue generation more than patient safety. Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief medical officer during Miller's tenure, was forced to resign when emails were discovered, showing that she had received multiple warnings about Miller's practices from nursing staff and had instructed her assistants to manage the situation quietly rather than investigate the concerns. In one particularly damning email chain, she wrote, "Miller brings in over $4 million annually in surgical revenue. We cannot afford to alienate him over nursing complaints that may be motivated by professional jealousy rather than legitimate patient care concerns." Professional jealousy. That's how she characterized my attempt to save Leo's life. The legal ramifications extended far beyond Miller's individual case. St. Mary's Hospital faced a class action lawsuit representing 14 families whose children had died following Miller's surgeries. The total settlement reached $43 million, and the hospital was required to implement oversight protocols that fundamentally changed how surgical decisions are made. No longer could a single surgeon, regardless of reputation, make unilateral decisions about organ acceptance or surgical approaches for pediatric cases. But money can't bring back dead children, and protocols can't erase the trauma experienced by families who trusted a system that failed them. I've stayed in touch with many of these families over the years, and their stories of grief and anger have shaped my understanding of what healthcare revenge really means. It's not about destroying careers or seeking financial compensation. It's about ensuring that the people responsible for preventable deaths face consequences that match the magnitude of their negligence. Maria Martinez, Leo's mother, became an unexpected advocate for healthcare reform after her son's death. She learned English through community college courses and eventually earned a degree in health administration. Today, she works as a patient advocate at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, helping Spanish-speaking families navigate complex medical decisions and ensuring that language barriers never prevent parents from understanding their children's treatment options. During a medical conference where I was presenting about the Leo Martinez case, Maria gave a speech that left the entire audience in tears. She spoke about the morning Leo was scheduled for surgery, how excited he had been because he thought he would finally be able to run and play like other children. She described holding his hand as he was wheeled into the operating room, promising him that everything would be okay, not knowing that she was sending her son to die. "Dr. Miller stole my son's future," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But he also stole my innocence. I will never again trust a doctor simply because they wear a white coat. I will never again assume that medical expertise means moral integrity. Leo's death taught me that sometimes the people who are supposed to heal us are the ones who hurt us the most." The conference attendees, hundreds of physicians, nurses, and administrators, sat in complete silence as Maria continued her speech. She wasn't seeking sympathy or offering forgiveness. She was delivering a challenge to everyone in that room to examine their own practices and ask whether they were truly putting patients first or simply protecting their professional interests. "You want to honor my son's memory?" she concluded. "Then never let another parent go through what Carlos and I experienced. Question the doctors who seem too confident. Listen to the nurses who express concerns. And remember that behind every medical decision is a family who trusts you with the most precious thing they have." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, and I watched dozens of healthcare professionals wipe away tears as they applauded not just Maria's courage, but their own renewed commitment to patient advocacy. Carlos Martinez took a different path through his grief. He returned to El Salvador 6 months after Leo's death, unable to remain in the country where his son had died. But he didn't retreat from the fight for medical accountability. Working with international healthcare organizations, he helped establish protocols for medical tourism safety, ensuring that families from developing countries who seek treatment in the United States are protected from predatory practices and false promises. Through Carlos's advocacy work, I learned about the global scope of medical arrogance and how vulnerable populations are particularly susceptible to exploitation by physicians who prioritize their own advancement over patient welfare. Miller's case was not unique. It was simply the one that got exposed. Around the world, there are countless Dr. Millers taking advantage of desperate families, performing unnecessary procedures, and covering up their failures with prestigious reputations and institutional protection. Ben Crawford, the resident who first warned me about Leo's transplant, completed his pediatric pulmonology fellowship and now runs a consultation program that specifically focuses on second opinions for complex pediatric cases. He's created a network of physicians who review transplant recommendations for families who have concerns about their children's proposed treatments. In the 5 years since Leo's death, Ben's program has identified over 30 cases where initial surgical recommendations were inappropriate or dangerous. Leo taught me that speaking up once isn't enough. Ben told me during our annual memorial meeting on the anniversary of Leo's death. You have to build systems that make it safe for people to speak up, and you have to create consequences for those who ignore legitimate concerns. One voice can be dismissed as inexperience or troublemaking, but documented patterns of concern can't be ignored, especially when they're supported by clinical evidence. Ben's program has become a model for other hospitals, and he's been invited to speak at medical schools about the importance of collaborative decision-making in high-stakes surgical cases. He always begins his presentations with a photograph of Leo Martinez, not a hospital photo, but one of Leo's drawings showing himself playing soccer under a bright blue sky. This is who we're really fighting for, Ben tells his audiences. Not the hospital administrators who worry about liability, not the surgeons who worry about their statistics, but the children who trust us to make decisions that will give them a future. When you're facing pressure to stay quiet about concerns, remember this little boy who drew pictures of himself breathing freely. Remember that he deserved better than what he got from us. The changes at St. Mary's have been comprehensive and permanent. The hospital now employs a full-time patient advocate who reports directly to the board of directors rather than to the medical staff. Any healthcare worker can file a concern about patient safety without fear of retaliation, and all concerns must be investigated within 72 hours. The hospital has also implemented anonymous reporting systems that allow staff to raise concerns about colleague behavior without revealing their identities. Most importantly, the Miller protocols require that any high-risk surgical decision must be reviewed by a multidisciplinary team that includes nursing staff, social workers, and independent physicians who have no relationship with the primary surgeon. No single person, regardless of their credentials or reputation, can make life or death decisions without input from others who are focused solely on patient welfare rather than professional advancement. These changes weren't implemented voluntarily. They were mandated as part of the legal settlement and are monitored by independent auditors who report to the state health department. St. Mary's administrative leadership fought against these requirements, arguing that they would compromise physician autonomy and create unnecessary bureaucracy. But the documentation from Leo's case and the pattern of negligence it revealed made their resistance impossible to maintain. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the forensic pathologist who performed Leo's autopsy, has since established a pediatric forensic pathology program that specializes in cases involving medical negligence. Her unit has investigated over 200 cases of suspicious pediatric deaths, and her findings have led to criminal charges against 12 physicians and major settlements for dozens of families. The Leo Martinez case taught me that autopsy findings are only meaningful if they reach the right people, Dr. Chen explained during a recent interview. We can document the truth with scientific precision, but that truth is worthless if it remains buried in medical records or dismissed by administrators who prioritize institutional protection over accountability. The real breakthrough in Leo's case wasn't the autopsy findings. It was Sarah's courage in making sure those findings reached people who had the power and motivation to act on them. Dr. Chen's program has become a national resource for families who suspect that their children died due to medical negligence. She works closely with patient advocacy groups and legal organizations to ensure that forensic findings are translated into understandable language for families, and that those findings are presented to appropriate authorities in ways that maximize the likelihood of meaningful action. The criminal case against Miller took 2 years to resolve. He was ultimately charged with involuntary manslaughter in Leo's death, and faced additional charges related to the other cases we uncovered during the investigation. His defense team argued that medical decisions made in good faith, even if they resulted in poor outcomes, could not constitute criminal negligence. They portrayed Miller as a dedicated physician who took on the most challenging cases and achieved remarkable success rates, despite working with desperately ill patients. But the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Morrison, had access to all of our documentation. They could show that Miller's decision to use compromised organs wasn't made in good faith. It was made in arrogance and with full knowledge of the risks. They could demonstrate that Miller had been warned repeatedly about the dangers and had chosen to proceed anyway. Most damaging of all, they could present a pattern of similar decisions that showed Miller's behavior wasn't an isolated mistake, but a consistent pattern of prioritizing his own reputation over patient safety. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and I testified for 3 days about Leo's case and the institutional failures that enabled Miller's negligence. It was the most difficult professional experience of my life, but also the most important. Sitting in that courtroom, explaining to 12 jurors how a 10-year-old boy had died because a surgeon was too arrogant to acknowledge his limitations, I felt the weight of every family that had trusted St. Mary's Hospital with their children's lives. Miller was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 8 years before being released on parole, and his medical license remains permanently revoked. But the real victory wasn't his imprisonment. It was the precedent his case established. For the first time in California legal history, a physician had been held criminally responsible for medical negligence that resulted in a child's death. The case created a legal framework that other prosecutors could use to pursue criminal charges against doctors whose arrogance led to preventable deaths. The civil lawsuit against St. Mary's Hospital revealed even more disturbing details about the institutional culture that had protected Miller. Internal emails showed that hospital administrators had been aware of concerns about Miller's practices for over 3 years, but had chosen to address those concerns through counseling and peer review rather than formal investigation. Risk management documents showed that the hospital's insurance company had identified Miller as a high-liability physician and had recommended restrictions on his surgical privileges, but those recommendations had been ignored by the medical staff leadership. Perhaps most damning was the discovery that St. Mary's had received complaints about Miller from other hospitals where he had worked previously. Miller's pattern of arrogance and negligence wasn't new. It was a career-long behavior pattern that had followed him from institution to institution as he moved between prestigious positions. Each time concerns were raised, Miller would resign and move to another hospital where his reputation preceded him, and his problematic behavior was overlooked in favor of his surgical skills and research potential. The legal discovery process revealed that Miller had been the subject of malpractice lawsuits at 4 different hospitals over a 15-year period. Each lawsuit had been settled confidentially, with non-disclosure agreements that prevented families from sharing their experiences publicly. This pattern of secret settlements had allowed Miller to continue practicing without consequences, moving from hospital to hospital while leaving a trail of damaged families who were legally prevented from warning others about his dangerous practices. Leo's case broke this cycle of secrecy because Maria and Carlos refused to accept a confidential settlement. Despite pressure from St. Mary's legal team and the promise of significantly more money if they agreed to remain silent, Leo's parents insisted that their son's story be told publicly. They wanted other families to know what had happened, so that no other child would suffer the same fate. "Money cannot bring back my son," Maria told the hospital's attorneys during settlement negotiations. "But maybe Leo's story can save another child. That is worth more than any amount you can offer us." Their decision to pursue a public resolution, rather than a confidential settlement, was the key factor that allowed the full scope of Miller's negligence to be exposed. Without their courage in refusing to be silenced, Miller's pattern of behavior might have continued indefinitely, and other children would have died unnecessarily. The settlement agreement included provisions that went far beyond financial compensation. St. Mary's was required to establish the Leo Martinez Patient Safety Foundation, an independent organization that investigates patient safety concerns and publishes annual reports about healthcare quality at the hospital. The foundation is funded by the hospital, but operates independently, with board members selected by patient advocacy organizations rather than hospital administration. The foundation has become a model for transparency and healthcare accountability. Their annual reports include detailed statistics about patient outcomes, medical errors, and safety incidents. They also publish summaries of patient complaints and the hospital's responses to those concerns. This level of transparency was unprecedented in healthcare and has been replicated at hospitals across the country. 5 years after Leo's death, the Leo Martinez Patient Safety Foundation published a comprehensive analysis of pediatric transplant outcomes at major hospitals throughout California. Their report identified significant variations in success rates and safety protocols, leading to statewide reforms in how pediatric transplants are regulated and monitored. The report also revealed that several other hospitals had physicians with concerning patterns similar to Miller's, and those physicians were subsequently investigated by state medical boards. The impact of Leo's case extended into medical education as well. Medical schools now include mandatory coursework on healthcare ethics, patient advocacy, and the importance of multidisciplinary communication. The Leo Martinez case is studied in detail as an example of how institutional hierarchies can silence legitimate concerns and enable dangerous practices. Medical students are taught to recognize and respond to concerns raised by nursing staff, and to understand that patient safety must always take precedence over professional courtesy or institutional loyalty. Nursing schools have also incorporated Leo's story into their curricula, but with a focus on the positive aspects of advocacy and documentation. Nursing students learn about the importance of detailed record-keeping, the proper channels for raising patient safety concerns, and the professional obligations that require nurses to speak up when they witness dangerous practices. They're taught that advocacy isn't just a professional responsibility, it's a moral imperative that defines the essence of nursing practice. The case has also influenced how hospitals recruit and evaluate physicians. Background checks now include reviews of malpractice history, even when previous cases were settled confidentially. Hospitals are required to contact previous employers directly to ask about any patient safety concerns, and physicians who refuse to authorize these contacts are disqualified from consideration. The pattern of secrecy that allowed Miller to move between institutions has been largely eliminated. professional licensing boards have also strengthened their oversight procedures. The California Medical Board now requires annual reporting of patient safety incidents and maintains a database of physician performance that follows doctors throughout their careers. Physicians who show patterns of concerning behavior are subject to increased scrutiny, and licenses can be suspended or revoked based on documented patterns of negligence, even if individual cases don't rise to the level of criminal conduct. But perhaps the most important change has been cultural. Healthcare workers at all levels now understand that speaking up about patient safety concerns isn't just permitted, it's expected. The fear of retaliation that once silenced legitimate concerns has been largely replaced by institutional support for advocacy and transparency. Nurses, in particular, have gained recognition as essential partners in patient safety rather than subordinate support staff whose concerns can be dismissed. This cultural shift didn't happen overnight, and it required constant reinforcement through policy changes, training programs, and visible consequences for those who attempted to suppress legitimate concerns. Hospital administrators who ignored or retaliated against staff members who raised patient safety issues faced termination and legal liability. Physicians who intimidated colleagues or dismissed nursing concerns found their privileges restricted or revoked. The message was clear. Patient safety takes precedence over professional hierarchy, institutional loyalty, or financial considerations. The changes weren't limited to St. Mary's Hospital or even to California. Leo's case became a catalyst for healthcare reform efforts nationwide, and his story has been shared at medical conferences, policy meetings, and legislative hearings across the country. The Leo Martinez Patient Safety Act, passed by the California legislature 2 years after his death, established mandatory reporting requirements for patient safety incidents and created legal protections for healthcare workers who report concerns about colleague behavior. Similar legislation has been introduced in 15 other states, and several have passed comprehensive patient safety reforms modeled after California's law. The federal government has also incorporated lessons from Leo's case into Medicare and Medicaid quality standards, requiring hospitals that accept federal funding to demonstrate compliance with patient safety protocols and transparency requirements. The ripple effects of one child's preventable death have transformed healthcare safety culture in ways that continue to evolve and expand. Every hospital that implements new patient advocacy programs, every medical school that teaches students about the importance of multidisciplinary communication, every nursing program that emphasizes the professional obligation to speak up for patients, all of these changes can be traced back to Leo Martinez and the courage of those who refused to let his death be dismissed as an acceptable loss. And that brings me to the most important lesson from this entire experience. Healthcare revenge isn't about destroying careers or seeking financial compensation. It's about creating consequences that prevent future tragedies and ensuring that the people responsible for preventable deaths face accountability that matches the magnitude of their negligence. Real revenge lies in building systems that make it impossible for another Dr. Miller to operate with impunity, in creating cultures that value patient advocacy over professional deference, and in ensuring that no other family has to endure what Maria and Carlos Martinez experienced. Leo Martinez would be 17 years old today. He would be a senior in high school, probably playing soccer like he always dreamed, breathing freely and planning for his future. Instead, he's buried in Riverside Memorial Cemetery, and his parents visit his grave every Sunday after church to leave fresh flowers and tell him about the changes his death has created in healthcare safety. But Leo's legacy lives on in every child whose life has been saved by the protocols established in his memory, in every healthcare worker who finds the courage to speak up because they know their concerns will be heard, and in every family that benefits from the transparency and accountability that his death helped create. That's the real hospital revenge. Not the destruction of those who failed us, but the construction of systems that ensure such failures become impossible. Leo Martinez died because one man's arrogance was more powerful than a child's need for proper care. Today, because of the changes his death inspired, that balance of power has shifted decisively in favor of patient safety and advocacy. Remember Leo Martinez. Remember his drawings of himself breathing freely. Remember his parents' courage in refusing to be silenced. And remember that sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is simply refusing to let a preventable tragedy remain hidden in the shadows of institutional protection and professional arrogance. The truth, properly documented and courageously presented, will always triumph over power, prestige, and profit. That's the lesson Leo taught us, and that's the legacy he left behind. A healthcare system that finally puts children's lives ahead of surgeons' egos. Justice for Leo Martinez. Justice for every child who trusts us with their future. And justice for the truth, no matter how powerful the people who try to hide it.